I'm going to talk about urban sustainability transformations of climate change and other contemporary challenges. And as you also already heard, my main focus is on cities, on urban studies. So I'm going to put this also center stage today, having in mind that, we have, as you all know, more than 55% already of the world population living in cities. And I'm going to put a particular focus today on the challenges that are related when it comes to urbanization, cities, and climate change. And but I'm also going to address the opportunities that I see that are already also existing, and particularly when it comes to interactions, integrated solutions, working with different actors together. And here I'm going to also focus a bit on other contemporary challenges, spreading some light on the current COVID-19 pandemics, for example, and putting this under the umbrella term of urban sustainability transformation, which I'm also going to explain later on a bit more in detail. So this is what I'm going to do today. And starting with the challenges that climate change put on cities. First of all, cities, of course, also contribute to climate change. We all know that when cities are built, and particularly when they are growing, and many of our cities are growing, particularly in population, this normally means that also we need more space, more living space, more space for different uses. So land use change is one of the main contributor also to climate change, because with more natural resources or natural surfaces that are converted into urban space mainly means that we have other surfaces, like most of all sealed surfaces, and this is of course also one contribution to climate change. We have high resource consumption in cities, and we are moving around, we have high mobility, and all this mainly contributes in terms of CO2 emissions and also heat. And one figure stands out that we have around 75% of global CO2 emissions that have their origin in cities. So, as I said, there are many different sources or reasons why our way of living and also moving around in cities and having all the industries and commerces as well, there's a huge impact. And the main contribution still comes from residential buildings, but also from, of course, commercial industrial buildings, from transport, but also from waste and sewage. And this is something that the nature, of course, does not really like, in the sense that it strikes back. And what happens, cities are, of course, also highly affected by climate change. Mainly what we see are extreme events that are impacting on cities, in the sense that we have through the higher intensity of rainfall events, we have flood events in cities because of the overheating and the higher temperatures in general that are, of course, one of the main outcomes of climate change are heat waves. And of course, Vienna is also one of the cities that is highly impacted by heat. This goes hand in hand with droughts. We also have storms that mainly impact on coastal or river cities, but of course, also other cities. And what is important here is that due to the high amount of people living in cities, the high amount of good infrastructures and services, they are, of course, also highly exposed to the impacts of flooding and heat, which I will also focus on in the following talk. And this makes also, or what is important to highlight here is that the risks that are coming or going hand in hand with these extreme events, and also the related vulnerabilities, that these are not always equally distributed. So we see differences between cities, but also within one city. So we have social spatial differences in a way that the impacts of climate change are affecting us. So coming from the challenges to the opportunities, I brought this citation. One of a colleague of us who wrote about the impacts, and he said that cities have been identified as key for sustainable development and climate change, since effective and integrated solutions can only be found and efficiently implemented through cities and urban areas. So with this, we see that cities are not only contributing to climate change and impacted by climate change, but they can play a key role in moving forward, in changing the situation, in contributing less, and finding also solutions for effectively bouncing back or adapting to the impacts of climate change. And this opens up, first of all, a socio-ecological systems perspective, because we have to consider the interactions between our way of living, our way of behaving and acting in cities, and the nature, and this means also the climate. And for me, three main points stand out here. That it is important to consider cities as complex, multidimensional, and also dynamic systems. And this complexity is something that is really, on the one hand side, very interesting in order to analyze and research cities, but makes also the research very challenging, because there are so many different aspects that we need to consider, and that there are so many processes ongoing, of course, apart from climate change, that are important for the development and of cities, and how cities are also providing living space for the people. And the second point is that it is very important to start at the root causes of the challenges. So really looking at what makes these interactions that I just highlighted briefly in terms of impacts and also contribution of cities, to look at the interconnection of the processes that are ongoing. And third, the integrated solutions. So how can we then come to integrated solutions that tackle these interconnection of the processes and bring us forward to more livability and more livability of cities. So with this in mind, I will first of all address the first two aspects, the complexity and the multidimensionality and the dynamics of systems of cities, and second, also the root causes of the challenges, by giving you an example from my research on urban vulnerability. And I'm not going to focus a lot on the context, but I would like to highlight it, that this research evolved in Latin America, in work that was undertaken in the metropolitan region of Santiago de Chile. When it comes to urban vulnerability, of course, the question is, what is urban vulnerability? What is vulnerability? So when we look into literature, in the emergence of the concept of vulnerability, it dates back to long time ago that the first notions of vulnerability came to the fore. And at the beginning, it was mainly based on research from the natural sciences, but later on, social sciences came much more in the fore, and looked at vulnerability also from very different perspectives. One thing that I would like to highlight here is that vulnerability looks at the structural changes in the system, which means that this is really also different from what I'm going to tell you later on about, for example, adaptation to climate change, that these structural changes in the system are something that are the basis, but not often addressed. And I will give an example just in the following. And the problem here is that these changes in the system that causes vulnerability are often not really addressed. Also when the vulnerability or when different vulnerability concepts are applied. Why? Because often they don't address the underlying specifics of the urban system. And that the urban system is very specific is key. We have different preconditions in cities than we have, for example, in more rural areas. And therefore, I see a discrepancy between what is often done, which is looking at the vulnerability in cities, or the urban vulnerability. And I'm going to give you now an example and more insights in the research that has been done by looking at the really specifics of cities and why we developed a new urban vulnerability concept and also a new assessment framework. So what we said, it is very important that first of all, we have this urban perspective. So what does it mean? Does it mean that we are key about that there is certain precondition, how cities are structured, how different places in a city are designed, constructed, that have an impact, first of all, on the vulnerability, and this includes, for example, how physical housing conditions are, how dense a certain area within the city is, how it's about the degree of imperviousness. It is about how many or how is the vegetation cover, and also includes access, for example, to basic services. And we said that this is something that first of all needs to be considered in order to identify certain areas within the city that are mostly or higher exposed when it comes then to extreme events, as for example, flood or heat. And we applied an approach that is based on social environmental structures. And this is based on a fragmentation approach, which I'm not going to go into more detail now, but which is something that is very common in Latin America, has also something to do with the high social spatial differentiation that is very traditional in Latin American cities, that we see a huge difference between richer and poorer people, and there are fragmentation approaches emerged. And we developed a specific social environmental fragmentation approach and considered this, as I said, as the precondition for the urban vulnerability concept and the further analysis. And the second perspective is then a more residential perspective, where we said it's important to look at specific houses and also the households that are living in these houses or buildings. And traditionally, there are three dimensions of urban vulnerability. That is first the exposure. So what are, in our understanding, when we're looking at specific areas then in the city, the housing conditions. The susceptibility dimension relates to the preconditions of the households, so not the area as in the urban perspective, but on the specific preconditions of the households. And the coping capacity is then the preparedness, or as it says, the capacities to cope with hazards or the impacts of flood and heat, in this case, on the household level. And putting this together, we developed this graphic, this figure that shows that when we put the urban perspective and the residential perspective together, then we speak about urban vulnerability. Then we can address the specifics of the urban system in terms of vulnerability to certain hazards. And of course, there are many underlying aspects like ecological, cultural, historical, also political, economic, physical, and social dimensions that also have an impact of the urban system that are to somehow already included in the urban perspective, but still have also a broader impact. And with this approach, we argue that we can really tackle the vulnerability of urban population living in certain spaces at the roots. We also can address the interaction of the different components in space, time, and scale, which means that we can really focus on the specific areas that are of high exposure. We have also dynamic indicators to some extent included, and we have the scale dimension also addressed. And we can look at the complexity and the interdependencies because we have these preconditions in the urban perspective, and then the outside hazards that are enforced by climate change. So having already talked a bit about the three dimensions of urban of the vulnerability in general, and then focused here on the residential perspectives on urban vulnerability, we developed indicators in the three dimensions, which we found important for the specific context of the metropolitan region of Santiago de Chile. And just to give you an example, when we have the exposure dimension addressed, we think it's very important to address, for example, the building structure, the building material, the type of the roof, the material of the roof, in order to say, well, to what extent are these houses exposed because they have a certain structure or a certain type of building. And also environmental indicators that we addressed here. So is there vegetation, how is the vegetation covered? Do they have a front yard? Do they have any trees in the front yard? So having a specific perspective then in these areas that are identified in the first. And for the susceptibility, we did the same. So here, the precondition to be vulnerable is, for example, the age structure of the household. So are there more elderly people in the household, or younger people, families, single households? Also, economic indicators. What is the socioeconomic status? So how is the education, and what kind of goods do the households have? So how well are they equipped, and which also says to what extent they will be are vulnerable. Environmental indicators, for example, if they have been affected by former events, which of course also relates to their knowledge and also to then their preparedness. And physical indicators, for example, interruption in water supply, which relates more to the heat aspect, where we see how much or how well are they connected to water. And this, of course, is something specific also for the case of the metropolitan region of Santiago de Chile, where water scarcity is also a main issue, which relates also to climate change. And the third dimension, the coping capacity dimension, has mainly social indicators, which are to some extent related to susceptibility, as I said before, the preparedness, for example, the awareness, so also social networks. So how well are they connected to other people? Do they inform each other when, for example, intensive rainfall events are going to happen, and in order to be prepared and to the events? And others are economic indicators. Here, there's also, again, the employment status, which comes again here into the force, and also environmental indicators. For example, how well or do they know about green spaces in the surroundings? Do they use the green spaces when it comes to heat events in order to have cooling effects, for example? So these indicators were the basis of our analysis, and I said we found them important. Of course, it was not only saying they are important. We did intensive literature review in order to define the indicators, and we had a lot of expert interviews in order to put these indicators together. And what did we do with these indicators? So we had these hazard maps, where in red you can see the potential of heat to occur in the metropolitan region of Santiago de Chile, and in blue the flood-prone areas. And we then identified these hotspots areas, as I said earlier, on the perspective of the urban perspective, and then we identified hotspots within these areas on the map. And with this, we were then able to assess, first of all, where people are living, so the precondition, how people are living, so the exposure side. We were able to find answers under which conditions people are living, so the susceptibility, and also how well they are prepared and able to take action when they are really affected by a flood or a heat event. And this relates then to the coping capacity. And for that, we did intensive field work. So we went around in the identified areas, in these hotspot areas, and we did a lot of field mapping. So, for example, about the physical indicators of exposure, we had a look at the different housing types, and also the environmental indicators, and then the susceptibility and the coping capacity was mainly assessed by household surveys. So we asked the households within the hotspot areas about the related aspects to the indicators that I just mentioned. And with this as a basis, we finally came up with maps that identify the different dimensions of vulnerability. And here you see one of the hotspots that we identified to be prone to heat. And when you look at the left-hand side, you see the exposure. And as you see, we identified about 411 houses in this hotspot. And in the top of the map, the dark red, you see those manzanas, that are these blocks that are marking one of these housing areas. You see that these are highly exposed due to what we assessed in terms of the indicators. And so this is one area that is of particular interest because there's high exposure. And when we then look at the susceptibility in the same area, you can see that this ranges from low to medium. So saying that the susceptibility, the precondition is low to medium, so not at the same level, high level. But when you look at the right-hand side, at the coping capacity, you can see that among the 150 households in general that have been questionnared in this area, so there's a part of those people living in this area, in this high exposure area, we see that the coping capacities are low. So we have high exposure and low coping capacities. So the people living in these areas are not really prepared when it comes to a heat event. And this for us was then the starting point to think about feasible measures that can be implemented, and also was the starting point to discuss adaptation measures with the municipality, because if the people living in these areas and people who are exposed are not able to cope themselves with heat events, there's of course also the question to what extent the municipality can then support them in being more prepared or in providing feasible adaptation measures. And here's only just for further explanation, one of the many definitions of adaptation. So adaptation is seen as the incremental adjustments that preserve systems integrity when conditions change. So saying that when we are able to adapt ourselves, then we have the possibility of the system, and then people and also infrastructure included in the system to adapt to the situation. So the question is, how can we adapt? Here, land use planning and urban development in general can, of course, play a key role. When we started the research in Latin America, adaptation was not much in the focus, and also not here much in the focus. So when I'm not now talking about the adaptation measures that we proposed, this is of course something that you now know all about, because climate change and climate change adaptation is also now much more in the focus of Europe and also Austria. But green infrastructure is of course one effective measure. We best, of course, parks, larger areas, but also single or individual trees can have an impact in terms of adaptation. Why? Because one effect, of course, is the cooling effect. It has to do with the transpiration, and also has to do with the shading of trees, for example. Of course, it also supports when it comes to flooding, because we have more, or we have the retention areas. So we have the opposite effect that we now have in cities where they have a lot of sealed surfaces, and the water that comes down when during an intensive rainfall event goes or can't go anymore in the canalization, because it's too much precipitation that is happening, and then we have this effect that the water just runs down, and the impact is then that we have flooding in the city. So of course, this is the reason why green infrastructure has both positive effects in terms of heat and flood events. How can we furthermore adapt? We can, of course, also adapt when it comes to buildings and the building structure. It also has to do with, for example, green roofs that can have the same effects when they are installed on roofs. We can also change the albedo with, for example, white roofs, not only on roofs, of course, also other surfaces. Green facades is also something that can mainly support heating, or to avoid or to limit heat effects within the buildings. When it comes to flood, we have also the potential to install backwater flaps or pressure-tight windows. So when large water masses come there with a high intensity runoff, then often it happens that the windows are just trashed. And so here we can also try to avoid this by enhancing the buildings or the windows in particular. Of course, part of the adaptation is also to think about good early warning systems. So when you think back what I just mentioned earlier, that it's important how well people are prepared when it comes to such events. A good and efficient early warning system is, of course, key, and risk management in general. So how to maybe also work on the upper-lying river streams, how to protect there with measures that support that when, for example, flood is not only based on intensive rainfall within the city, but also relates to overflooding of rivers. There a lot can also be done in terms of infrastructures. And one additional aspect, what is also very important, and I would like to highlight here, that we need to enhance the knowledge transfer. So we have to educate also people, to raise awareness, and we have to figure out mutual learning. Also, cities can learn from each other in exchange on good and also maybe bad practices. Okay, this was adaptation, but adaptation, of course, is not the only thing. It relates to what I highlighted before in terms of vulnerability, but of course, coming back to what I said before about the contribution of cities to climate change mitigation and the potential for mitigating climate change in cities is, of course, something that can be further worked on. So when we think about, for example, compact cities, so the idea of increasing density, of trying to avoid further sealing of the surfaces, further avoiding further extension in the outskirts of the urban hinterland, by developing more compact cities, we have the potential to mitigate climate change, because this, of course, also impacts on the mobility. If we have more compactness, we have less mobility, we have shorter distances that we have to do when moving around in the city. This, of course, relates to efficient public transportation and also includes sharing systems where we can avoid the use of individual cars within the city, for example, or to combine public transportation with car or bicycle rides, for example. A lot of potential is also there in terms of decentralized energy supply, and of course, also mainly renewable energy supply. And related to what I said before in terms of adaptation, we can, of course, also do things related to buildings when we think about other building materials, and in order to, in general, limit the impacts on the climate in general. This can be supported by technologies and digitalization. I'm sure you have heard a lot about smart housing, smart mobility, also smart metering. So the way that we can make efficient use of new technologies and digitalization. But here I'm always key, and some of you who have already been in my courses also know that, and we have worked on that together, that there's always the double major task related. So whenever we use technology, digitalization, there's also the risk that this goes hand in hand, for example, with an increase of energy use. And we also need to see that we avoid rebound effects, that we avoid that certain people are not included and that they don't have access to technology and also digitalization in terms of, for example, access to apps or other facilities. So wrapping briefly up, the basis to develop integrated solution and to take action, we have to address urban complexity. We have to look at the structural changes ongoing, going back to the urban perspective of vulnerability. We have to consider the really urban specifics. We have to consider individual coping capacities, and something that I did not focus on because of the time, it, of course, also the institutional adaptive capacity. So when I said that's also in the responsibility of the municipalities to support people. The question, of course, is how well are these institutions themselves aware about the challenges and the problems. Here, of course, interdisciplinary research is key. We work together with natural scientists, we work together with modelers, with climate experts. We also worked together with engineers when we developed the measures for the metropolitan region of Santiago de Chile. But something to add here is coming back to adaptation as one approach to tackle the vulnerabilities. This is rather a proactive action, of course. So it happens when we had flood events, when we are affected by heat, then people are starting to take action. But the question is if this is enough, if these incremental changes are enough in order to address the contemporary challenges in cities. And here I would say no, in a sense it's not enough. Yes, it needs more, it needs radical transformative thinking. And there are many papers also published in this context right now, and that it's important that we don't only try to scale up incremental approaches. It can be a way forward. So many incremental activities can also make a more fundamental change, but it needs to go even beyond that. It needs to be more holistic. And it needs to include the social, ecological, and even technological systems approach that I already targeted out. And it needs to provide systemic leverage. So meaning that we really need to think about new governance processes to develop also pathways to upscale global sustainability transformations. And with this, I'm coming to the term transformations and also to the term sustainability. So what are transformations? When we look this from the climate perspective, referring to a definition that had been stated by the IPCC, transformations are about altering fundamental attributes of a system. And this includes regulations, legislation, and also bureaucratic regimes. It has to deal with financial aspects and also technological and biological systems. So it needs more radical changes. And if we talk about this, we are aiming at transformations in the sense of urban sustainability transformations. We also talk about more radical also multi-dimensional iterations of systems, and that needs to go across borders and has to deal with the many different developments in place. So the argumentation is here that adaptation, of course, is important, as mitigation is important as well. But in order to address the challenges and the pressures, more radical transformations are needed. And as I promised at the beginning, I'm now going to go briefly also in the current challenges that we see in the outcomes of the COVID-19 pandemics. The question would be if this pandemic situation would maybe open up a window of opportunity for more radical transformation. And let me say why, because the pandemic, of course, has really shown us that the way cities are built might not be the best way. And so a new focus or a new lens has been put forward, because before that, as many people argued for climate change and the need for changes. But as you all know, this discussion is ongoing already for a very long time, and not much happened for decades. No? So the question is, as we now become really more aware about the importance of public and private green spaces during the pandemics, if this is now going to change something in our minds. Because if you think back, it was a lot about social distances. It was about the wish to go out for leisure, to have activities outside. And there was also an increased demand again for suburban spaces. So people looking for spaces outside of the city to escape to some extent to the limitations that pandemics gave to us. So fundamental new questions came up, which, again, has shown that the role also that local governments play as a provider of services that are closest to the people came to the front. So we need to really think about how we develop the cities and the spaces in order to address the many challenges at hand. So, having spoken beforehand about the compact city model as one example, so the density and the compactness of city structures, the question is, how can we make efficient use of existing urban space? And what came up during the pandemic also was the idea of really remodeling, for example, underused spaces, brownfields, and converting them into multi-purpose spaces. So adding something to the idea of greening. So why now not mixing up different uses? Now, why not using parking spaces also for other purposes when they are not needed as parking spaces? And the question is, if we, for example, look at this model that has been developed first developed in Barcelona and now also came to Vienna, the idea of the superblocks. If we maybe start to think about how we can restructure certain areas within the city, a certain district, for example, thinking about closing some streets and open up the space for people for greening, but also for interaction. So do we need all the space for cars and other purposes in the city, or can we think about new ways of designing the space? And when we then think about the approach followed up by the city of Paris, which is put forward by the mayor, Mrs. Hidalgo, who talks about or who implemented the 50-minute city, which of course very much relates to the density, compactness aspect, and the idea of having all basic services within a 50-minute area to be reachable. The question is this a fundamental transformation? does this go towards urban sustainability transformations? Or another idea of the circular city. I'm not going into much detail because I don't have the time, but the idea also came up some time ago, and now under COVID-19 had more intensity, thinking about how much do we depend on global, regional, national resource flows and also export importation. So can we design more circular cities by closing the loops, by redesigning the system, by using material longer than before? So the idea of changing the general idea of how cities are designed and supporting this with bottom-up initiatives by people. And here again, can this lead us to the fundamental transformation? So I would say yes to both. This can be activities that really change something more fundamental. So coming back to what I said, integrated solutions, the third aspect I wanted to highlight. What are the challenges and opportunities? We, of course, have many resource conflicts and conflicts of interest. So we have, of course, climate change not as the only challenge. We have the demographic change. We have many social, spatial differentiations. We have crisis, and everything is then about how we negotiate. And this is very challenging in cities because we have this high actor diversity. So we have the government, industry, academia, civil society center stage. So we have to negotiate and we have to consider all the different perspectives. So how can we do that? And what is needed in terms of integrated solutions development? We need this user orientation. We need to think about the people, their interests, their values, their preferences. We have to consider mutual learning. We have to think about how to integrate and transfer knowledge. And we have to think about how we can come up with a problem or solving problem by development of measures, innovations, and strategies. And here I will just briefly go, and I'm looking at the time that I'm already by the end of my 45 minutes, but I have a few more slides to present. So I would just like to highlight briefly that if we want to follow up these aims and to achieve those aims, then we need, in addition to the interdisciplinary perspective that I highlighted, also transdisciplinary and transformative research. And what does it mean? I'm not going to show to explain the whole graphic, but focus on the last two graphics that you see here, the blue ones, transdisciplinary research, addressing the real world challenges and topics, thinking about how we can leave the ivory tower of research and interacting with non-academic actors in the urban scene. And designing research questions jointly and tackling the problems jointly is one of the main aspects of transdisciplinary research. And transformative research even goes further. It says that we have to address the real world problems, but we even have to jointly design interventions. So we work together on the solutions. And with this, we have also the capacities of trying to push a transformative approach towards sustainability. So transdisciplinary research emerged in the 1990s and is a complementation of disciplinary and interdisciplinary research. It considers itself as a society or life world oriented research, so really tackling the societal questions and problems. And framing this jointly, as I said, is at the core of transdisciplinarity. And transformative research, as I said, goes even further, explicitly thinking about how to intervene and how to catalyze processes of change. For this, we need different knowledges. we need additional knowledge to do that we normally gain when we do our disciplinary and interdisciplinary research. We can bring knowledge together in even better understand the system and the challenges. We can develop knowledge about desirable futures, to think about what is the future of the cities, the sustainability that we have. So a normative framework or framing that underlies this. And this transformation knowledge. So really producing knowledge that can shape the transformation processes that have an impact on sustainability, and to test this and also develop this further and to apply then experiments together is one of the key aspects of transformation knowledge. And well, what are the challenges and requirements? You can imagine that is not an easy task to do this kind of research. There are many challenges involved because of the different expectations of the people that are coming together, the many different actors. It has to do with capacity building. It has to do with the transfer, the exchange on knowledge that is not always easy, coming together with so different people in a research environment. And this requires, of course, trust in the process, trust in the people involved. It needs legitimacy also to do that kind of research. And it's a lot about communication, of communicating about the goals of the research. It's communication about the process, the outcome. And this also then goes back to the trust and the credibility of what is ongoing. So here, transparency is one of the keywords as well. Transparency about uncertainties, about limitations, and very important to always accept also the framing conditions. When something changes, political framing changes, or actor constellation change, transparency is very important. So this is now I'm coming now to the end, concluding how to achieve and support urban sustainable transformations. I have given you some examples. I started with the urban vulnerability complexity perspective, which calls for interdisciplinary research collaboration. I also told you about the solutions to the challenges that need to have an integrated character and that need really to be connected to the real world, as I tried to explain, and where we are looking for transdisciplinary and transformative research collaboration. And yeah, the transformative power that is always or often mentioned in the sense of what can cities contribute, coming back to the beginning, to lessen the impacts on climate change, and then also further broadening up the perspective of general or more larger challenges. It's important that we really have very in-deep knowledge on the local context and the challenges, and that we involve a wide range of actors. And as shown up by the example of the COVID-19 pandemics, trying to make use of opportunities, take up the possibilities that are there and try to really convert the theoretical thinking into real action. So final thoughts, and something I would also like to give you now as the starting point for further discussions. So sustainability, coming back to the framing of urban sustainability transformation, is of course a process and not an endpoint. And of course, it can be interpreted as constantly shifting targets. So we need to define what sustainability means. And this also means that the objectives of urban sustainability transformations may vary from city to city and also over time. And the framing of urban sustainability transformations is more an umbrella framework. And the process is there very important. It includes a lot of learning and also adapting to different circumstances. And my final words are of course, research can provide guidance, information, knowledge, and recommendations, but I'm very much on the side that the ultimate action lies with the social actors. And here we have to think about new forms and ways of mutual learning and also knowledge exchange.